I think we probably all like a good wedding, don't we? Personally, I've liked weddings ever since I was a lad, because in South Yorkshire, where I grew up, we had a custom there. And the bride and her father would come out of their house and get into the wedding car, and all the kids from round about would gather because as the car was about to drive off, the dad would thrust his hand into his best suit pocket and take some coins that he'd prepared there and toss them out of the window. And we would all rush to see how many we could get. It was what was called the wedding scramble for obvious reasons. And that's why weddings were pretty popular. Still today, weddings are popular events, aren't they? People will travel far and wide to come to a good wedding. And a wedding is the setting for our parable that we're looking at today in our new series, Stories for All Seasons, God's Wisdom for Life through the Parables of Jesus. You can find it in Matthew chapter 25. And I'm going to read from the Christian Basics Bible, which is based on the New Living Translation, which is a modern edition that will help us get something of the flavour of it. This is Jesus speaking. The kingdom of heaven will be like 10 bridesmaids who took their lamps and went to meet the bridegroom. 5 of them were foolish and 5 were wise. The 5 who were foolish didn't take enough olive oil for their lamps, but the other 5 were wise enough to take along extra oil. When the bridegroom was delayed, they all became drowsy and fell asleep. At midnight, they were roused by the shout, "Look, the bridegroom's coming! Come out and meet him!" And all the bridesmaids got up and prepared their lamps. Then the 5 foolish ones asked the others, "Please give us some of your oil because our lamps are going out." But the others replied, "We don't have enough for all of us. Go to a shop and buy some for yourselves." But while they were gone to buy oil, the bridegroom came. Then those who were ready went in with him to the marriage feast, and the door was locked. Later, when the other 5 bridesmaids returned, they stood outside calling, "Lord, Lord, open the door for us." But he called back, "Believe me, I don't know you. So you too must keep watch, for you do not know the day or hour of my return." We seem to have developed a tradition in the West of the bride arriving a few minutes late for the wedding ceremony. I think it's to keep the groom on his toes, isn't it? And to get him thinking, is she coming? Isn't she coming? I actually had one wedding I was taking many years ago where the bride was 90 minutes late. The guests had given up the will to live by the time she arrived. And when I actually went to meet her at the door and sort of did a, "Were you held up?" she sort of giggled and said, "Oh, am I late?" Well, here's a story where it's not the bride who's late, but the groom who's late. So let's take a look at the cultural background of weddings in those days that will help us understand what was going on. Now, in Jesus' day, weddings were normally held in the evening, which is why a central feature of this parable is these lamps. Now, please don't think of these sort of little clay lamps like this sort, the sort that could be held in your hand, filled with oil and the little wick lit there. This is one that I actually got in Israel on one of our tours there. There's another one next May, by the way. Jesus is not thinking of little lamps like that. He's thinking of what we would perhaps call these days torches. No, not the kind that run on Duracell batteries, because according to their adverts, the batteries wouldn't have run out and it would have completely destroyed the purpose of this parable, wouldn't it? He's thinking of the sort of torches that were long poles with rags tied around the end that were dipped in oil and then lit, a bit like in the picture alongside our reading. Now, the The bride and the bridesmaids got ready back at her father's home. Once they were ready, the bridesmaids would then go in a torchlit procession from the bride's home to the groom's home, would knock on the door and say, "She's ready for you." And then they would escort the groom in another torchlit procession back to the bride's home. He would then collect his bride, and together in, yes, another torchlit procession, they would go back to his home where the marriage ceremony would actually take place under the marriage canopy. And then the party would begin once the ceremony was over, and it would last until the early hours of the morning. So yet more need for torches through the night. Now, unlike today, a wedding ceremony and its party afterwards didn't just last for that one occasion. Weddings used to last for 7 days, and you invited the whole village to it, which, by the way, is why Jesus turned so much water into wine in the wedding at Cana. It had to supply the whole village for a whole week. But because of all those comings and goings and the party lasting for 7 weeks, I hope you can see why not only torches were important, but having a good supply of oil was important too. Now, a torch would normally burn for about 15 minutes or so before it eventually burnt out. And when it did, you'd have to trim its edges, any burnt bits of rags, cut them off, dip it into your jar of oil that you'd brought along with you, and relight it again. Now, you would have needed extra oil even if the groom hadn't been late. But this groom was late. Very late. Actually, very, very late. That by the time he eventually comes out of the house, the bridesmaids have been sitting outside, perhaps in the smoky atmosphere from their torches, had drifted off and nodded off, when suddenly they're awakened with a cry from inside saying, "Here comes the groom!" Now, the 5 wise bridesmaids are ready. They've got their jars of extra oil. They dip their torches into it and light it, ready to lead him to his bride's home. But of course, the 5 foolish ones didn't bring any extra oil. So now they go along to the others and say, "Oh, excuse me, could I borrow some of your oil?" And understandably, the 5 wise ones say, "No, sorry, I could easily run out. You'll have to go to the shop and get some yourself." And so they rush off to get fresh supplies. But while they're doing that, the groom comes out of the house and the procession begins back to the bride's home. Now, Jesus sometimes missed out the detail of stories. He just picked out the key bits, and that's what he does here, because he doesn't have them then going back to his home in that procession, but simply arriving there, and once they're there, the door being shut and barred and bolted. At which point, the 5 foolish bridesmaids turn up, knock on the door and say, "Hello, it's us, let us in." But they've blown their invitation. So what is God's wisdom for life for us through this parable? Well, the parable's meaning is really summed up in the last 2 words of the reading that we read together. Those last 2 words were "my return." This is a parable, Jesus said, about his return to this world at the end of the age. So let's think about that under 2 simple headings: what and so what. Let's think about what first of all. What do we mean by the return of Jesus, or as it's sometimes called, the second coming? Well, this is the Bible's teaching that at the end of human history as we know it, Jesus will return to gather to himself all who have ever believed in him throughout history, to destroy all evil, to renew and restore the world that he has made, and to make that a place where we can dwell with him and his Father forever. Now, I think until probably pretty recently, for most people, any talk of the end of human history as we know it might have seemed a bit far-fetched, relegated to those crazy guys in some of the high streets of our town with their banners, "The end of the world is nigh." But in times of serious global warming and serious global pandemics, suddenly I think people are seeing that the very concept of the end of human existence as we know it is no longer as weird or strange as we once might have thought. And Jesus said it most definitely isn't a stupid thought. He said that he was most definitely coming back to this world one day. And that's the theme of a whole collection of parables in Matthew 24 and 25, of which the one that we read was just one example. The central theme to all of them is that Jesus is coming back one day. Now, frankly, there are lots of different slight interpretations of some of the detail of how that's going to happen. But I think there are three things that stand out very clearly that we can all agree on. The first is, Jesus tells us that when he comes again, his return will be sudden and unexpected, like the appearance of that bridegroom in our parable. His return will be when we least expect it. As a Bible teacher and as a pastor, I've been asked many, many times over the years, particularly when some crisis has occurred, like the Cuban Missile Crisis of my youth or the coronavirus crisis of today. "Pastor, in the light of the present crisis, do you think this is a sign that Jesus' return is getting close?" And my answer has always been the same. I have no idea, and nor does anyone else. Because listen to what Jesus himself said about that in one of his parables in Matthew 24. "No one knows the day or the hour when these things will happen, not even the angels in heaven or the Son himself. Only the Father knows. So you must keep watch, for you don't know what day your Lord is coming. Understand this. If a homeowner knew exactly when a burglar was coming, he would keep watch and not permit his house to be broken into. So you also must be ready all the time, for the Son of Man will come when least expected." Burglars simply don't announce when they're going to come. And nor will I, Jesus said. His return will be both sudden and unexpected. Now, in the parables in Matthew 25, of which ours was one, the person who's coming is later than expected. Interestingly enough, in all the parables in Matthew 24, the person coming is earlier than expected. Earlier? Later? Listen, no one knows the day or the hour. His return really will be sudden and unexpected, which is why he calls us in that parable to be ready, the very thing that the foolish bridesmaids weren't. Second, his return will be public and visible. The first time Jesus came to this world, it was a very quiet, very secret affair, very obscure, very hidden. Very few people knew about it. But it won't be like that when he comes again, Jesus said. In the previous chapter in Matthew 24, Jesus used this picture to describe what it will be like. "For as lightning that comes from the east is visible even in the west, so will be the coming of the Son of Man." There's no mistaking lightning, is there? When it flashes, and everybody sees it. And that's how it will be when I come again, Jesus says. Public, visible, everyone will see it, as surely as they saw the groom coming out of his home in the village. Now, for me personally, that doesn't leave an awful lot of room for that idea of a secret rapture, so popular in many Christian paperback books and movies like the Left Behind series. The secret rapture is the idea that Jesus will come before the end of the age and secretly take away all the Christians so that they miss the horrors of the end time and the worst that the Antichrist will do. And so you get stories in these books of Christian pilots flying planes that, because they're whisked away, will suddenly crash to the ground, or cars will crash into the trees at the side of the road if they'd had a Christian driver who was taken away. Now, I don't know if you know this, but that concept really only dates back to about 1830. And a guy called J.N. Darby, who was the founder of the Plymouth Brethren movement. And his idea was picked up, particularly in the USA in the 20th century, which is where it was hugely popularized. But an idea that's really so recent in church history should at least make us consider the possibility that it might not be right, or why hadn't people seen it before? For me, the New Testament says when Jesus returns, he returns, it will be utterly public and visible. And in the words of Revelation chapter 1, verse 7, every eye will see him, and there will be no place to hide. The third what about the return of Jesus is that it will be glorious and triumphant. Let me read you another passage from this collection of parables about his return in Matthew 24 and 25. Immediately after the anguish of those days, the sun will be darkened, the moon will give no light, the stars will fall from the sky, and the powers in the heavens will be shaken. Now, you'll note there that last part is in inverted commas, and that's because Jesus was quoting there from the prophet Isaiah. Now, the words that follow are his own. And then at last, the sign that the Son of Man is coming will appear in the heavens. And there will be deep mourning among all the peoples of the earth. And they will see the Son of Man coming on the clouds of heaven with power and great glory. And he will send out his angels with the mighty blast of a trumpet. And they will gather his chosen ones from all over the world, from the farthest ends of the earth and heaven. Jesus' second coming will be characterized by great power and glory and triumph as he comes to gather all who have believed in him, to take them to himself, to renew this world and to rid it of all evil. So, in light of this teaching about the return of Jesus, in light of this what, so what? What does the New Testament call us to do and be? Well, here's God's wise words for living. The first so what is be warned. The parable of the bridesmaids, like those other parables in Matthew 24 and 25, all speak to us of the fact that Jesus can return at any moment. And so we always need to be ready. Not fearfully, no, expectantly. Because when he does come, it really will be the end of human history as we have known it. And if we've died by the time that day comes, then we will return with him from heaven, Paul tells us in 1 Thessalonians chapter 4. And he'll gather us in and invite us into his kingdom. And at that point, the door will be shut like the door was shut in that parable of the bridesmaids. And there will be no opportunity to change our mind. Either we'll be on the inside because we completely aligned ourselves with Jesus, or we'll be on the outside because we didn't. And there will be no opportunity to, as it were, borrow oil from others. There'll be no opportunity to say, oh, my grandma was a Baptist, or I used to go to church when I was younger. That's just like trying to borrow someone else's oil. Do you know, I will never forget the day that I went to my dentist and she said to me, "Do you floss?" Knowing well the answer from what she could see in there. And I stupidly said to her, "No, but my wife does." What a daft thing to say. What does my wife flossing have anything to do with my teeth? I have started flossing regularly since that day, however. You see, each of us is responsible for our own lives, and we will be on that day. If we have made him Lord of our life and have lived with him as Lord of our life, then we will be most certainly welcomed in to that wedding banquet. And if we won't, then we will be left outside. And that, Jesus said, will be sheer hell. Now, I know we don't talk much about hell these days, do we? But you know, in the Bible, no one talks about hell more than Jesus. And yes, he used lots of pictures, lots of metaphors to describe it. So at times he describes it as a place of darkness. At other times he describes it as a place of fire, which would seem to be almost the very opposite, isn't it? Because fire gives light. A place of darkness, a place of fire, a place of anguish. It will be like the rubbish dump of life, the Gehenna. Gehenna was Gehinnom, the valley of Hinnom. That was the rubbish dump in Jesus' time. It will like be being excluded from the best wedding banquet that you've ever been to. A whole variety of images and pictures that he uses. But it all adds up to this. Jesus saying, however I describe hell, you really, really do not want to be there. And here's the great thing. You don't have to. Because Jesus tells us that if we will put our faith and trust in him and live life his way from this point forward, then he can forgive us all our sin, past, present, future, make us absolutely clean, and give us like fresh garments like those 5 wise bridesmaids had, and be invited into his banquet. But if we don't make that decision, we're excluded. We're on the outside forever, Jesus warned. Now, if you think you're ready to make that decision, maybe you've been watching a series of services for some weeks now and you think, I really am ready to make that decision, then if you go to our website, there is a page there that has a short 7-minute video that will explain to you how you can ask Jesus to forgive your sins and invite him into your life and start living for him. And if you're not quite ready for that step, then there's another part of that site that will invite you to an opportunity to find out still more so you can make an informed decision for yourself. But for those of us who have made a decision for Jesus and are living for him, then I want to say to you today, friends, truly, we have nothing to fear of that day and have everything to look forward to. Be warned. Secondly, be wise. The parable of the bridesmaids is a parable about being wise about the way that we live. Those 5 wise bridesmaids had extra oil. And it wasn't just extra oil just in case as a sort of insurance policy. They knew they were going to need extra oil as the wedding ceremony stretched on. 15 minutes wouldn't just help them to wing it. They'd made wise choices. And the wise will still today make wise choices about their life, about what they do with their life, their time, their money, their family, their job, their leisure, their future, their plans. They'll make wise choices in the light of what Jesus invites us to in his word. I just wonder if some of us haven't been making very wise choices recently about the way we've lived with Jesus. Oh yeah, we've made a decision to commit our lives to him, but frankly, we're winging it. We're trying to get away with the bare minimum in our relationship with God. You know, with God, there is always more. There's always more to be asked for and to be received into our life. Last year, God spoke to us prophetically about this being a season when he wanted us to experience as a church double depth and double breadth. And that promise is still true, coronavirus or not. You know, oil in the Bible is often a symbol of the Holy Spirit. And his Holy Spirit is always richly, freely available to fill us and to fill us again, even today, especially if we've run dry. Be wise today. Ask him to fill you again with his Holy Spirit, that you might live ready for Jesus' return. Be warned, be wise. Here's the third one. Be watchful. All the parables in Matthew 24 and 25 assure us of the certainty of Jesus' return and therefore call us to be watchful but not fearful in light of that. Now, I don't think being watchful means we've got to become readers of the signs and times. We've already seen that Jesus himself said no one knows the day or the hour. So we don't need to waste time looking at the news and thinking, China's becoming a global threat. Does that mean Jesus is coming? Oh, coronavirus is spreading around the world and getting worse. Does that mean Jesus is coming? Oh, Donald Trump has done something stupid. Again, does that mean Jesus is coming? No, we don't need to focus on all those things. And frankly, going down those routes always ends up leaving us looking silly, as history itself shows us again and again. Now, you see, the things that we're called to be watchful about are not so much out there, but in here. We just need to be watchful that we're not getting lazy or sloppy in our relationship with Jesus, that we're not, as it were, nodding off like those bridesmaids, that our prayer times and our Bible reading times aren't getting shunted or skimped or missed, that our commitment to being part of our community group is still strong because of the support and challenge that it gives us, even though it is more difficult in these times. That we're not skimping on our Sunday morning gatherings together because it's not very convenient and I'll watch the video later and then the week gets busy and I somehow just don't get round to it. And anyway, there's all those repeats of EastEnders to catch up with. Yeah, the truth is it can be harder to engage online. I certainly find it that way. But this is a choice, friends, to be watchful about our lives and to do everything that we can to be among the 5 wise rather than the 5 foolish. Be warned, be wise, be watchful. There's the what, and there's the so what about the return of Jesus. Everybody likes a good wedding. And there's a good wedding, a better wedding than a wedding we've ever seen coming without a doubt one day. Let's make sure we're preparing for that, living in the light of that, eagerly anticipating that, and doing everything we can to tell others about it so that we can be ready for when he comes. And that, dear friends, is definitely God's wise word for living.